A single moment of laughter can expose everything a powerful man is trying to hide. The sound of glass and soft luxury filled the private dining room of the Manhattan Sky Lounge, where Ethan Carter, a billionaire CEO known for turning entire industries with a single decision, leaned back in his chair and laughed as if the world itself had agreed with him. Around him, investors and elite guests followed his lead, smiling politely, reacting not to the truth but to the weight of his presence. Across the room, Aaliyah Johnson moved quietly between tables, a black waitress in a crisp uniform, balancing plates and conversations with the kind of calm that made her almost invisible to people like him. But invisibility for Aaliyah was never absence. It was observation. She had learned to read rooms the way others read headlines, noticing what was said, what was avoided, and what was carefully dressed as confidence. Ethan's voice carried again, sharp with amusement as he retold a business story, framing a failed deal as a joke only someone as powerful as him could afford to laugh about. The table around him responded instantly, their laughter rehearsed, their loyalty effortless. Yet Aaliyah's steps slowed just slightly as she passed within earshot, her attention catching on a detail in his words that did not align, a fracture in the narrative so small that no one else seemed to notice. Her expression did not change, but something inside her settled into certainty. Ethan Carter was not just telling a story. He was controlling one. She continued her work, placing a glass of water on a nearby table, but her awareness remained anchored on him. Ethan leaned forward, still smiling, still in command, unaware that across the room, someone had already stopped accepting his version of reality at face value. Aaliyah adjusted her tray, her movements steady, controlled, almost silent, as if the room itself had trained her not to disturb its hierarchy. But beneath that silence, she had already begun to see the structure of his confidence, and more importantly, where it could crack. The laughter continued around Ethan Carter, rich and effortless, but in the space between one breath and the next something subtle shifted. Not in him, not yet, but in the way one person in the room was no longer listening the same way as everyone else. And that difference, unnoticed by all but her, would soon change everything. Aaliyah Johnson continued moving through the restaurant with steady precision, balancing the rhythm of service with the quiet discipline of someone who had learned long ago that attention was something you controlled, not something you chased. While across the room Ethan Carter remained the center of gravity for everyone else, still leaning back in his chair, still smiling as he expanded on his story, as if it were entertainment rather than history. His voice carried easily, polished and confident, describing a failed acquisition as though it had been a clever maneuver rather than a setback, and each word was met with the kind of laughter that did not question, only followed. Aaliyah returned to the service station, setting down an empty tray, but her focus stayed on him, replaying the phrasing he had used, the sequence of events he casually presented, and the timing that felt just slightly off from what she had once read in a financial briefing months ago while cleaning up tables between shifts. Something about the structure of his explanation did not align with the known outcome of that deal, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet factual contradiction that most people would miss because they were listening to tone rather than truth. Ethan gestured lightly as he spoke, enjoying the room's response, his confidence reinforcing itself with every nod around the table, while Aaliyah's expression remained neutral, professional, unreadable, though her awareness had sharpened into something more focused. She moved again, collecting dishes from a nearby table, and as she passed closer to Ethan's section, she caught a fragment of his conversation where he referenced numbers that did not match the market reports she had seen, a discrepancy small enough to ignore unless you were trained to notice patterns in broken systems. The elite guests around him continued to laugh, unaware that their certainty was built entirely on trust in his authority, rather than verification of his words, and that realization settled quietly in Aaliyah's mind without urgency, only clarity. Ethan's laughter rose again as he concluded his story, leaning slightly forward now, enjoying the attention like a man accustomed to being both narrator and final authority in every room he entered, and for a brief moment he glanced across the space, his eyes scanning without interest, passing over Aaliyah without recognition. She did not react, only adjusted her grip on the tray and continued walking, but internally she had already reconstructed the narrative he was presenting and identified the missing piece that no one else had questioned. It was not just that he was wrong in one detail, it was that the confidence with which he spoke depended on no one ever challenging it. At the far end of the room, a quiet exchange between two investors briefly contradicted his version of events. A subtle hesitation in their response that confirmed what she had suspected, and Aaliyah felt the structure of the moment shift even further, though outwardly nothing changed. Ethan Carter remained the same. Composed, dominant, smiling, but now the room around him contained a truth he had not accounted for, and in that gap between perception and reality, Aaliyah understood something simple and precise, that power in this room was not held by the one speaking the loudest, but by the one who knew when the story no longer matched the facts, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider what would happen if that fact was spoken out loud. Aaliyah Johnson stood near the service counter for a brief moment, her eyes lowered as she adjusted the edge of her tray, but her mind remained fixed on the inconsistency she had already identified in Ethan Carter's story. A contradiction so subtle that it would have disappeared completely inside the comfort of his authority if she had not been trained to notice how powerful people often reshape truth into something more convenient. Across the room, Ethan continued speaking without interruption. His voice steady, confident, and layered with the ease of someone who had never been publicly corrected in a space like this, and every sentence he delivered seemed to strengthen the belief of those around him that his version of events was the only one that mattered. Aaliyah moved again, collecting empty glasses from a nearby table, her steps quiet against the polished floor, while her attention tracked the rhythm of his speech, noticing how he emphasized certain details that subtly redirected responsibility away from himself in the story he was telling. The investors around him nodded in agreement, their laughter softer now, more controlled, as if they were participating in a shared understanding that did not require verification, only alignment with his confidence. Ethan leaned slightly forward as he spoke, gesturing with casual authority, and the room followed his lead instinctively, but Aaliyah's focus sharpened further as she recognized a second inconsistency. This one tied to timing, a detail that did not match the public record she had once seen during a late shift when she had briefly scrolled through financial news while cleaning a table. She placed the glasses onto a tray with deliberate calm and stepped away, her expression unchanged, but internally the structure of the moment had shifted completely, because what she was seeing was no longer just arrogance or storytelling, it was construction, a carefully shaped version of truth designed to survive without challenge. Ethan laughed again at something one of the guests said, the sound easy and practiced, and the table responded instantly, reinforcing his position without question, while Aaliyah stopped briefly near a side station, her gaze briefly crossing the room toward him for the first time with full awareness rather than passive observation. In that single glance, she registered not just his confidence, but the fragility hidden inside it, the way his authority depended entirely on uninterrupted belief from the people around him. A server passed behind her, asking for a refill at another table, pulling her back into motion, and she responded with quiet efficiency, yet her thoughts remained locked on the structure of Ethan's narrative, mentally tracing the gaps between what he said and what she knew could be verified. The center of the room, Ethan raised his glass slightly as he concluded another point, smiling as if the conversation itself had already been resolved in his favor, and for everyone else it had, but for Aaliyah, the moment had become something else entirely, not a performance to observe, but a system to decode. She returned to the service station, placing the tray down with controlled precision, and as she did, she made a decision that did not show on her face, did not alter her posture, and did not interrupt her work, but changed the direction of everything that would follow, because now she was no longer simply listening to him speak. She was preparing for the exact moment when the story would no longer hold. Aaliyah Johnson moved back into the flow of service with the same controlled rhythm as before, but now every step carried a quiet intention that did not exist earlier, because she was no longer simply observing the room, she was anticipating the exact moment the structure would fail. Ethan Carter remained at the center of the dining room, still speaking with effortless confidence, his voice shaping the attention of everyone around him like a current that no one thought to resist. His laughter returned once more, lighter this time, as he added another detail to his story, and the guests responded instantly, their expressions reflecting trust rather than scrutiny. Aaliyah approached a nearby table to collect empty plates, but her focus never left him, especially when he began referencing a timeline connected to the business deal he had been discussing earlier, a timeline that she now recognized as inconsistent with the public financial records she had mentally reviewed. The discrepancy was small, almost invisible to anyone who did not understand how carefully corporate narratives were constructed. But to her it stood out like a misaligned piece in a perfect pattern. Ethan gestured again as he spoke, his confidence unshaken. But something subtle was beginning to shift in the way he held the room. Not because anyone questioned him yet, but because truth, once noticed, begins to change how silence behaves. Aaliyah placed the plates onto her tray and stepped away, her movement smooth and professional, but her decision had already formed fully in her mind. She crossed the room with steady pace and approached the edge of Ethan's table, stopping just within the boundary of his influence, where the laughter had not yet reached its natural end. For a brief second, no one acknowledged her presence, because people like Ethan rarely registered service staff unless necessary, but she did not wait to be seen. Instead, she placed the check folder gently on the table beside his glass, the sound soft but precise, cutting through the rhythm of his speech without interrupting it. Ethan paused mid-sentence, not out of confusion, but out of instinct, as if something in the timing had briefly disrupted his control over the moment. He looked down at the folder, then up at her, his expression still composed, still confident, but now slightly recalibrated by her proximity. Around him, the conversation continued for another second before fading into awareness that something had changed in the immediate space between speaker and listener. Aaliyah did not speak immediately, her posture calm, her expression neutral, but her eyes held the same clarity that had been building since the first inconsistency she noticed. Ethan leaned back slightly, giving a faint smile as if expecting a routine interaction, but the room had already begun to quiet in response to the subtle shift in energy. Then, without raising her voice, Aaliyah spoke a single sentence, measured and precise, directed only at him, and the meaning of it was not in its volume but in its accuracy, because it referred to a detail in his story that only someone with direct knowledge of the truth could have known. The effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Ethan's smile stopped first, not fading gradually, but collapsing in place as recognition replaced amusement. His eyes sharpened as he processed what she had said, and for the first time since he entered the room, he did not respond instantly. The guests around the table felt the change before they understood it, the way a conversation loses its rhythm when a hidden assumption is exposed. Aaliyah remained still, her presence unchanged, as if she had simply completed a task, but the space around Ethan Carter had already shifted into something unfamiliar, because the story he had been telling no longer matched the reality that someone in the room was now willing to acknowledge. And in that silence that followed, the power he had held so effortlessly began to separate from him without a sound. The moment Aaliyah Johnson finished speaking, the atmosphere around Ethan Carter did not explode, it collapsed in silence, as if the air itself had forgotten how to move, and for the first time since he entered the restaurant, the Billionaire CEO did not have an immediate response ready. His smile, once effortless and controlled, remained frozen for a fraction of a second before slowly fading into something more neutral, more guarded, as his mind worked to process the exact detail she had mentioned, a detail that should not have been accessible to someone in her position. Around the table, the investors shifted subtly in their seats, their earlier confidence now interrupted by uncertainty they did not know how to express, because they had spent the entire evening reinforcing Ethan's version of reality, and suddenly that version had been challenged without warning. Aaliyah stood still beside the table, her posture unchanged, her hands resting calmly near the check folder, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But her eyes remained steady on Ethan, not aggressive, not emotional, only precise, as though she had simply corrected a factual error in a quiet room. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, measured in a way that contrasted sharply with the confidence he had displayed earlier, and he asked a question designed not to confirm the truth, but to regain control of the narrative. Yet even as he spoke, it was clear that control had already begun to shift away from him. A brief silence stretched between them, and in that silence, the other guests at the table no longer laughed or reacted. They simply waited, sensing that they were no longer participants in a performance but witnesses to something unplanned. Aaliyah finally moved, not stepping back, not retreating, but simply adjusting her position by a few inches, placing the check folder more firmly on the table, reinforcing her presence in a way that was quiet but deliberate, and then she repeated nothing, explained nothing, She only allowed her previous statement to remain in the space between them like an unchangeable fact. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her now with a different level of attention, not as a server moving through the room, but as an unknown variable he had not accounted for, and for the first time that evening, his authority did not fill the space automatically. One of the investors cleared his throat, attempting to reintroduce normal conversation, but the effort failed to restore the earlier rhythm, because the foundation of that rhythm had already been disturbed. Aaliyah did not react to the attempt. She simply waited, calm and composed, as if time itself was no longer a pressure she needed to respond to. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back again, but this time the gesture did not signal comfort, it signaled recalibration, and in that subtle shift, it became clear that he understood something had changed, not just in the conversation, but in how he was being perceived. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Carter was not the person defining the moment, and as he looked at Aaliyah standing quietly beside his table, he realized that the story he had been telling all evening was no longer stable, because someone in the room had already seen the part he had carefully left out, and that awareness alone was enough to begin unraveling everything he thought he controlled. A quiet tension settled over the table, heavier than the crystal glasses and polished silverware, as Ethan Carter remained still for the first time that evening without an immediate response, his usual dominance over conversation replaced by a careful, measured silence. Aaliyah Johnson stood beside the table, her posture unchanged, but her awareness fully present, watching not his face alone but the subtle reactions of everyone around him, because power in a room like this was never held by one person alone. It existed in how others responded to that person. Ethan finally shifted, slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the edge of the table as he studied her with a new kind of focus, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but evaluating, as if recalculating something he had assumed was already understood. He spoke again, this time slower, asking her to clarify what she had said earlier, but the question was not truly about information, it was about reclaiming structure, about restoring the version of reality where he remained the center of certainty. Aaliyah did not rush to answer, and that pause itself became louder than anything else in the room, because it interrupted the expectation that she would immediately step back into invisibility. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably and tried to redirect attention back to the conversation, but the attempt failed, dissolving quickly into the silence that had already taken hold. Aaliyah finally spoke again, her voice calm and steady, repeating the same factual detail in slightly different wording, not to provoke, not to challenge emotionally, but to confirm accuracy, and that precision made it harder to dismiss. Ethan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time, he looked away from her for a brief moment, as if checking the reactions of the others around the table to regain context. But the reactions were no longer unified. The earlier rhythm of agreement had fractured, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty that none of them wanted to acknowledge directly. Aaliyah placed one hand lightly on the edge of the table as she leaned in just enough to ensure she was heard clearly, and in doing so she narrowed the distance between herself and the authority Ethan had been projecting all evening, not through confrontation, but through presence. She mentioned another detail, one that tied directly to the earlier story he had told, and this time there was no ambiguity left in the air, because the inconsistency she pointed out connected directly to something verifiable, something that could not be brushed away with confidence alone. The effect was immediate but quiet, like a switch being turned off rather than a collapse, and Ethan's face reflected that realization, as he slowly stopped speaking altogether. For a brief moment, the entire table existed in a suspended state where no one attempted to fill the silence, because everyone understood that something fundamental had just shifted, even if they could not yet name it. Aaliyah straightened again, returning to her neutral posture, and stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but restoring professional distance, as if her role in the interaction had already been completed. Ethan remained still, his gaze fixed on her now without interruption, no longer shaped by confidence or performance, but by the uncomfortable awareness that his version of control had been interrupted by someone who had not raised her voice once. And in that silence, the balance of the room changed in a way that no one at the table could ignore, because for the first time, Ethan Carter was not the one defining what was true, and he could feel it happening without a single person needing to say it aloud. A heavy stillness held the table as Ethan Carter remained motionless for several seconds, his usual confidence no longer projecting outward but turning inward as if he was replaying every word that had just been spoken and measuring where the structure of his narrative had begun to fail. The investors around him no longer spoke, no longer laughed, and no longer looked at him with the same effortless trust, because the interruption had not been loud or emotional, but precise, and precision in a room like this carried more weight than volume ever could. Aaliyah Johnson stood a short distance from the table, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged. Yet her presence now carried a different meaning, no longer invisible, no longer background, but anchored in certainty that could not be easily dismissed. Ethan finally exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as if attempting to reclaim physical control over a moment that had already shifted beyond comfort. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the earlier ease that had defined him throughout the evening. He asked her how she could possibly know the detail she mentioned, framing the question carefully, not as accusation, but as an attempt to rebuild authority through explanation. Yet even as he spoke, it was clear that the question itself revealed uncertainty that he had not intended to show. Aaliyah did not respond immediately, and that silence became the center of the room again, stretching just long enough for everyone present to feel it settle into place. When she finally spoke, her tone remained calm and factual, explaining nothing beyond what was necessary, repeating the detail with a quiet clarity that made evasion impossible, because there was no emotion in her delivery, only accuracy. One of the investors shifted in his seat, glancing between Ethan and Aaliyah as if searching for permission to interpret what was happening. But no one offered guidance, because the familiar structure of authority had already weakened. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he listened, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, he appeared less certain of how to proceed, not because he had lost an argument, but because the framework he relied on to define conversations had been disrupted. He glanced briefly toward his colleagues, expecting reinforcement, but what he found instead was hesitation, and that hesitation was more destabilizing than disagreement would have been. Aaliyah adjusted her stance slightly, not stepping forward, not retreating, but maintaining distance that emphasized control without confrontation. And in that simple adjustment, the dynamic shifted again because it became clear that she was not trying to win anything. She was only revealing what was already there. Ethan looked back at her, studying her now with a different awareness, no longer filtering her through the assumptions he had carried earlier in the evening. And for the first time he seemed to recognize that her silence was not absence, but choice. The room remained suspended in that tension, where no one dared to restart the conversation that had been interrupted, because restarting it would require ignoring what had already been exposed. Aaliyah finally stepped back half a pace, returning fully to her professional distance, as if concluding an interaction that had never been intended to escalate, and yet had already changed everything it touched. Ethan did not speak again immediately, and in that absence of response, the hierarchy of the room quietly rearranged itself without announcement, without confrontation, and without permission. And as Aaliyah turned slightly as if preparing to return to her work, it became unmistakably clear that the balance of control in that room no longer belonged to the man who had been speaking the longest, but to the one who had spoken the least, and chosen her moment with absolute precision. A long silence settled across the table after Aaliyah Johnson stepped back, not because anything else was said, but because nothing needed to be said anymore. And that absence of sound carried more weight than the earlier laughter that had once defined the space. Ethan Carter remained seated, his posture still composed, yet something in the way he held himself had changed, as if he was no longer fully anchored in the version of reality he had been projecting all evening. His eyes stayed on Aaliyah as she turned slightly away, preparing to return to her work, and for the first time there was no immediate confidence behind his gaze, only analysis, careful and slow, as if he was trying to locate where exactly control had slipped from him. Around the table, the investors no longer attempted to continue conversation, their earlier ease replaced by cautious stillness, because they were now aware that the rhythm of the evening had been interrupted in a way that could not simply be reset. Aaliyah moved a few steps away from the table, her expression unchanged, her pace steady, but the atmosphere behind her did not return to normal. It remained suspended, as though the room itself was waiting for something unresolved to conclude. Ethan finally leaned forward again, breaking the silence not with authority but with restraint, and when he spoke, his voice no longer carried the effortless dominance it had earlier. Instead it carried something closer to controlled uncertainty. He asked Aaliyah to stop for a moment, not commanding her as before, but requesting, and that shift alone was noticeable to everyone at the table. Aaliyah paused, turning slightly back toward him, her posture calm, her attention steady, but she did not approach. She simply waited, allowing him to define the next movement if he still could. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then glanced briefly at the investors, as if trying to recover the structure of a conversation that had already slipped beyond its original frame. But no one stepped in to support him, because no one was certain what position they were now supposed to take. He finally asked her, in a quieter tone, what exactly she had been implying, and the question was no longer rhetorical, it was genuine, because the certainty he had carried earlier had already fractured. Aaliyah answered without hesitation, repeating nothing dramatic, only confirming the detail she had already pointed out. And in doing so, she made it clear that what she had said was not interpretation, but observation. Ethan listened without interruption this time, and as she finished speaking, he did not immediately respond, which itself became the most important moment in the room, because it marked the first time he had not corrected or redirected a narrative in real time. One of the investors attempted to laugh softly, as if to release the tension, but the sound faded quickly without finding support, because the structure it depended on no longer existed. Ethan slowly leaned back again, his expression no longer composed in the same way, and for a brief moment he looked less like a man in control of a room and more like someone trying to understand how the room had stopped responding to him. Aaliyah remained still, neither advancing nor retreating, and that stillness itself became the center of attention, because it was no longer passive, it was intentional. Ethan finally lowered his gaze toward the table, as if processing not just her words, but the fact that they had been spoken without fear, without hesitation, and without regard for his status. When he looked up again, the confidence that had defined him at the beginning of the evening had not disappeared completely, but it no longer functioned in the same way, because something had already taken root in its place. Uncertainty that could not be ignored. And as Aaliyah turned fully this time and began to walk away from the table, it became clear to everyone present that nothing about this room would return to what it had been before she spoke. Aaliyah Johnson continued walking away from the table with steady composure, her steps calm and unhurried, but behind her the atmosphere inside the room had permanently changed, as if the air itself no longer belonged to Ethan Carter in the way it had only minutes earlier. No one spoke immediately after she left, because the silence she left behind was not empty. It was full of unresolved meaning, and every person at the table felt it differently. Ethan remained seated, his hands resting lightly near the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the space where she had stood, not as if he was watching her leave, but as if he was replaying every second that had led to that moment. For the first time that evening, his expression carried no trace of humor, no trace of performance, only focused thought, and that shift alone changed how the entire table perceived him. One of the investors finally cleared his throat and attempted to speak, trying to restore the normal flow of conversation. But his words came out carefully, uncertainly, and quickly faded without response. Ethan did not immediately rejoin the conversation. Instead, he slowly leaned back, exhaling through his nose, as if recalibrating a system that no longer responded the way it should. He glanced around the table, noticing that no one was laughing anymore. No one was reinforcing his tone, and that absence of reaction created a gap he could not easily fill. After a long pause, he finally spoke again, but his voice was different now, lower, more controlled, and stripped of the effortless dominance he had carried earlier. He did not try to continue his previous story. Instead, he acknowledged the interruption indirectly, asking a question about what had just been said, not to challenge it, but to understand it. Aaliyah, now a few steps away, stopped briefly but did not turn fully back, maintaining distance, allowing the space to define itself without rushing to close it. Ethan watched her carefully, his expression no longer dismissive, but analytical in a way that suggested he was no longer certain where the advantage lay in the interaction. The investors exchanged brief glances, each of them aware that something had shifted beyond a simple correction or misunderstanding, because the structure they had relied on throughout the evening had not simply been questioned, it had been destabilized. Ethan finally stood up slightly from his chair, not fully rising, but leaning forward enough to signal a renewed attempt at control, and he asked Aaliyah directly how she had obtained the information she referenced. The question was no longer casual, it carried weight, because now it was tied to something he could not easily dismiss. Aaliyah turned her head just enough to meet his gaze without stepping back toward him, and in a calm, even tone, she confirmed once again the detail she had already stated, without elaboration, without emotion, without seeking validation. That restraint made the moment sharper, because there was nothing in her delivery for him to push against or reinterpret. Ethan held her gaze for a few seconds longer, then slowly sat back down, and in that simple movement, the final layer of his earlier confidence dissolved into something quieter and less certain. No one at the table spoke after that, because there was nothing left to reinforce the version of events Ethan had presented earlier, and the absence of his usual control left a space that no one knew how to fill. Aaliyah finally turned away completely and walked out of the immediate area, returning to the rhythm of her work as if nothing had changed. But behind her, the room remained frozen in a new reality where Ethan Carter was no longer the only person whose words defined what was true.